They erased Earth and rewrote history, but humanity endured in silence, waiting for the galaxy to remember. Now the forgotten have returned, not with warships, but with memory that burns brighter than any empire. This time, they didn't come to conquer. They came to answer the question no one else dared ask. They didn't notice Earth's silence at first. In the vast noise of interstellar politics, economic collapses, and the ever-growing bureaucratic machinery of the Galactic Council, one world falling quiet was barely a whisper lost in the winds of empire. Earth had always been difficult, volatile, unpredictable, hard to integrate. When its last outgoing signal was registered as garbled static and emotional code fragments, the Council's automated flagging system categorized the event as internal systemic collapse, a formality. The Terran homeworld was archived under cultural expiration, probable. No ships were sent. No investigation was ordered. The system's trade routes were quietly rerouted. Earth was never declared dead. It was simply forgotten. That was 74 standard cycles ago. Now, in the far rim, where Council control phrased like fabric left an acid wind, things were beginning to move again. At first, it was rumors. Ships glimpsed in dark transit lanes, asymmetrical, bearing no known profile. Ghosts with hulls burned matte black, edges jagged like unfinished metalwork. No ID beacons. No hails. But always the same sighting. A vessel drifting slow, silent, watching. Then came the first act. A derelict mining station in the Coral Drift, condemned after biocontamination wiped out most of the staff, reported a system reboot. Life support came online. Automated repairs executed. Containment restored. The remaining workers didn't know how, until they found a message handwritten on one of the hab walls in 5 languages. We don't forget who was left behind. There were no ships in range. But an external camera captured one moment, a streak of black metal leaving the station's gravity well. Angular. Human. Back on Central Core, Council analysts dismissed it. They'd seen cultural imitations before, rogue engineers playing savior, frontier cults romanticizing Earth's last broadcasts. Nothing new. Except this time, something was different. Every system that reported contact with the black vessels showed signs of repair. Infrastructure improved. Old colonial reactors reignited. Relay networks brought back online. Not for conquest. Not for reward. Just restored. And every time, the same words were found etched, scratched, or projected into local space. Terran Protocol, recovery phase active. The words weren't a threat. They were a return. Commander Vienna of the Deep Accord Watch was the first to publicly raise the alarm. They're not gone, she said in her report to the Grand Table. They're just quiet. And they've had 70 cycles to remember what silence felt like. Her recommendations were buried. She was reassigned to a diplomatic station on the outer edge of civilized space, a polite exile for the politically inconvenient. But she kept listening. And so did others. Scattered through the archives of the galaxy were fragments, memories of Terran contact, hidden in neglected stations, buried under layers of encryption, classified by departments that no longer existed. A name began to emerge. Not Earth. Not humanity. Just this. The quiet reclaim. Not an empire. Not a movement. A pattern of actions that could not be traced to any fleet, any government, any known state. A pattern that matched only one thing: old Terran behavior before the collapse. Help given without request. Presence without explanation. Correction without demand. And always the same closing phrase. We were left to fall. But we stood anyway. In the Lithen border zone, a minor war broke out between 2 resource clans. Standard Council peacekeepers arrived late, underpowered, and unprepared. Before reinforcements could be dispatched, the war ended. Not with negotiation. With silence. Both sides were incapacitated by non-lethal signal pulses delivered from an unknown ship above the upper atmosphere. The pulses rewrote targeting systems, disabled reactors, neutralized propulsion. When asked what happened, the survivors described only one thing. A voice. Calm. Cold. Speaking through every channel. This is not a battlefield. You will not turn it into one again. No casualties. No prisoners taken. And when Council warships finally arrived, they found only a black shard of alloy buried in the desert. Etched with one word. Delta. Historians began to whisper. Archivists returned to restricted files long thought irrelevant. Old Terran cultural fragments were decrypted and reanalyzed. The deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. Earth hadn't died. It had retreated. And in the dark, in the silence of its own abandonment, it had rebuilt something the galaxy had never truly understood. Not fleets. Not colonies. But conviction. On an isolated moon in the Yarnes cluster, a deep scanning probe discovered a listening post, not council, not criminal. Built into the stone. Ancient design, but operating on modern encryption. Inside was a vault of memories. Digital dreams extracted from dead systems. Final messages from dying ships. Calls for help never answered. All preserved. All cataloged. All relayed. The probe's last log, before failing, recorded one final data stream from the structure. A voice. Human. Emotionless. This time, we're listening. The phrase, "this time, we're listening," echoed across clandestine comm channels and fringe pirate hubs for weeks. No official network acknowledged it, but everywhere it spread, quiet things began to change. Hallway stations that had fallen into disrepair were suddenly restored to full function. Slum worlds and council-abandoned sectors began receiving encrypted shipments of food, fusion cores, and medical nanites. The sender never identified. The pattern unmistakable. The Terrans hadn't returned to conquer. They'd returned to finish what no one else had the will to start. Council efforts to suppress the movement only amplified it. Public statements calling the sightings misinterpreted anomalies were met with growing skepticism. In the shadow networks, images of black-holed vessels, sharp-edged and flame-scored, circulated like sacred iconography. Each sighting came with a phrase, growing more unified over time. The reclaimers remember. And then came the turning point. On Kesari, 4, an orbital reactor failed catastrophically above a civilian megadome, a failure predicted decades ago and ignored by both council engineers and corporate stakeholders. The dome would have collapsed. Over 400,000 sentients would have died. But it didn't. Because 37 seconds before critical failure, a fleet of 6 unmarked Terran vessels dropped into orbit. They didn't transmit. They just acted. Drones deployed. Gravitic anchors fused to the dome structure. Subreactors rewired. Power redirected. Collapse arrested. It took less than 9 minutes. When the local governor tried to contact the fleet, one ship replied. A woman's voice. Measured. Flat. Human. "We don't ask for thanks. We ask what took you so long." Then the fleet vanished. Kesari's citizens rioted. Not against the Terrans. Against the council, for doing nothing again. And from the wreckage of the riots, a new faction formed. Not secessionists. Not revolutionaries. They called themselves the Echo Accord. Their stated mission, not to follow the Terrans, but to replicate their model. Decentralized response networks. Autonomous emergency action. Prioritizing action over authorization. Their manifesto was just 12 lines long, but the last 3 were repeated the most. "We are not Earth, but we listened. And now we remember what duty means." The council responded with force. Too late. Because Earth hadn't sent armies. It had sent an idea. One that couldn't be blockaded or bombed. It could only be seen and chosen. In a sealed vault beneath the ruins of Perel Station, thought lost for over a century, an ancient drive was reactivated by a rogue archivist. Inside, the uncut footage of Earth's last recorded conference before the silence. It showed no war map, no final command, just a group of scientists, engineers, and citizens standing in a shattered hall, swearing to launch at least one self-sufficient archive core into the void. Their closing vow. "If history won't remember us, we'll make sure someone has to." That core had survived. It became the nucleus of what analysts now call the Terran Deep Echo Protocol. Not a plan for vengeance. A plan for preservation through presence. At the galaxy's edge, in the uncharted sweep, a long-range deep drift vessel encountered a signal wall, a structure made entirely of linked quantum resonance fields. The vessel's crew logged dozens of microbursts short, dense phrases embedded into space itself. Each one was a memory. Someone's first breath. A final goodbye. A scream that no one heard. A promise made on an orbiting station that burned 5 minutes later. All recorded. All real. All human. The signal wall had no weapons. But no ship that entered emerged unchanged. Because it made everyone remember what had been forgotten. Within months, outposts and 22 fringe systems reported shifts. Old alliances crumbled. New compacts emerged. Not centered on Earth. Centered on service. Be the hands they never sent. That became a prayer. And with it, a symbol spread, not imposed, not stamped. Drawn. Delta. The Delta mark. Found in ruins. Etched into metal. Projected in the quiet between stars. Always in places where Terran intervention had occurred. Never signed. Never claimed. Only left. Council High Command issued Directive Glaveil, full containment and destruction of all Delta-class vessels on site. But no one could find their origin, their bases, their leadership. The ships came and went like echoes in a canyon. Because the reclaimers didn't need territory. They only needed proof that the galaxy was still broken. And then, they fixed it. Again, and again, and again, until denial was no longer an option. There was a moment, somewhere between the 6th Delta appearance in the Harkin span and the complete restoration of 4 collapsed orbital habitats over Atraxas, 5, when the galaxy stopped asking if the reclaimers were human, and began asking how they had become more than that. Not stronger, not smarter, just unwavering. Where the Council hesitated, they acted. Where the Accord negotiated, they remembered. Where others gave up, the Terrans reappeared, like echoes of a promise the stars had long since broken. And with every act, they didn't demand allegiance. They asked only one question. Will you do the same when it's your turn? On Dalinar Prime, a hyper-urbanized cultural core built atop 6 centuries of genetic stratification, the first non-Terran monument in the Delta style was raised. A single spike of matte steel, unmarked except for a single sentence. Your world survived because someone you forgot didn't forget you. It became a pilgrimage site within days. The council condemned it. The people guarded it. And beneath that spike, hundreds of citizens began recording their own confessions, the crimes their governments had buried, the calls for help they once ignored, the history that had been made sterile through policy. Every one of those recordings was sent into the deep net. And everyone was answered. By ships no one could trace. The Reclaimers had become something the galaxy didn't have a word for. Not saviors. Not liberators. Not even Terrans. They were carriers of memory. And the one rule they followed always was this. Where someone was left to die, we return. In the fringes of the Kissel Cluster, a bio-collapse zone triggered mass evacuations. The Accord deployed a relief fleet. It failed to arrive in time. But the Terrans did. No authorization. No debate. They constructed stabilization webs, terraformed emergency shelters, deployed medical nanites tuned to 12 incompatible species. It should have been impossible. But when the Accord fleet finally arrived, the entire region had stabilized. No thanks given. None expected. A signal was left in orbit. You took too long. But we forgive delay, not absence. Within the Council's intelligence branch, once suppressed files began to resurface forcefully and from within. Officers started leaking internal memos detailing old Terran aid proposals rejected during the last decades before Earth fell silent. Emergency algorithms, multiracial aid models, cooperative crisis protocols. Every one of them turned down. Every one of them implemented now, not by governments, but by ghosts that refused to stay buried. The leaks couldn't be stopped, because they weren't leaks. They were confessions. And soon, even Council historians stopped calling Earth's collapse a failure. They began calling it what it really was. Abandonment. Aboard the Reclaimer-class vessel Covenant Drift, one of the oldest surviving Terran ships still running Core Delta Protocol, a crew member was asked, on a rare open-channel relay, why? Why return? Why interfere? Why now? The answer was quiet and devastating. Because when we screamed, no one came. We made sure no one else would feel that way again. Entire sectors began repainting their aged ships in Terran black, not as tribute, as promise. The Delta color no longer meant human. It meant response without hesitation. On Etravan Theta, a strange thing happened. Children, raised on stories of Council unity and Accord justice, began to ask for bedtime tales from the silence. They wanted to hear about the ships that arrived when no one else would. About the broken world that refused to die. About the voices that kept whispering across stars even when the galaxy stopped listening. And when asked what the Reclaimers were, one child said, "They're the ones who came back, because we forgot they were still hurting." Council worlds tried to resist the narrative. They passed bans on Delta marks, decriminalized memory alteration tech, issued blockades on known Reclaimer lanes. None of it mattered, because truth moves through witnesses, not wiretaps. And Earth had made witnesses of the entire fringe. It wasn't war. It was conviction with mass. And when it reached enough people, gravity did the rest. Entire systems stopped waiting for authorization. They started responding. Delta-style vessels were built in backwater yards. AI frameworks were reprogrammed to prioritize need over command. And from the smallest moon to the oldest city in the Accord core, a new phrase found its way into every language. We are what remains, and we will not let you vanish. The Council's central doctrine, order before emotion, protocol before presence, had always governed by distance. Detachment was their shield. Efficiency, their justification. But detachment has no answer for conviction that won't go away. The Reclaimers didn't argue. They acted. And when you act in the places where no one else will, you become the truth, not because you're loud, but because you show up. In the ice ring cities of Mersgate, an old deep space observatory came online for the first time in 50 standard years. It had been left to die too far, too costly, too politically insignificant. But it carried one message in its final data burst, an impending black hole arc swing that would threaten 3 inhabited systems in its trajectory. The Council dismissed the finding. Not enough data. Not worth the rerouting cost. The Reclaimers acted in 12 hours. They didn't warn. They redirected. Fleet maneuvers, gravitic amplifiers, phased mass projectors, technology presumed lost with Earth. The arc swing was neutralized. No press conference followed. Only this message left in every threatened system's relay buffer. We are still watching the sky. For you. The people of Valai, a Council-aligned industrial world, wrote their own response. They shut down their planetary holoscreens for one day. Broadcasted no entertainment. Only old Earth recordings. Emergency logs. Memorial songs. The last surviving planetary broadcast before Earth went dark. Over 9 billion beings sat in silence, listening to the end of a world. And when it ended, they stood together and said aloud, "Never again," to anyone. That was not rebellion. That was reclamation. The council's control structure began to crack, not from sabotage, not from war, but from internal refusal. Mid-tier officials resigned. Station governors left their posts and joined the Echo Accord. Council databases began showing error codes where classifications of Earth and Delta entities had once been redacted, because no one could pretend anymore. The lie had rotted, and something far more dangerous had taken its place. Witnessed memory. On the exiled world of Naiven, long sealed after an uncontrolled AI war, a small group of descendants survived in orbital ruins. They had grown up in silence, with only fragments of history. One of their jury-rigged transmitters picked up a repeating Terran signal. A child's voice, laughing, then saying, "If you're out there, we kept your seat." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. The reclaimers responded. 3 ships entered Naiven space, restored orbital balance, supplied clean atmospheric processors, re-established uplink. They said nothing, left no demands. Only planted a crystalline beacon in orbit with a single icon pulsing across its surface. Delta. And the Naiven people chose, without decree, without doctrine, to paint that same symbol across every remaining panel of their city's hull. Because they finally felt remembered. In the innermost corridors of former Council Command, surviving officials began drafting an unprecedented statement, not to assert control, but to release it. It was called the Statement of Absence. It read, "We failed to answer. We failed to believe. And now we recognize those who answered anyway. You are not an empire. You are not a threat. You are the echo we deserved. And if we have anything left of value, it is the silence you broke." They broadcasted it, and the galaxy stood still. The Delta mark became more than symbol. It became infrastructure. Whole systems restructured their logistics around Delta response timing, not whether action was permitted, but whether action was needed. Entire species began mapping their cultural trauma, uploading it to memory satellites modeled after Terran design. Each memory sealed in a crystalline lattice, each one freely accessible, each one labeled with a phrase now found in every known language. We listened too late, but we still listen. And Earth? Earth never broadcasted coordinates, never spoke from a position of centrality. Because Earth had never come back to be found. It had come back to be remembered properly, not as a warning, but as proof that a world can break, burn, vanish, and still return as the voice that answers when no one else will. The stars had begun to listen again. And what they heard was not conquest. It was a voice saying, "We endured the silence, so you wouldn't have to." They began calling it the second light. Not a new empire, not a rebellion, a re-illumination of what it meant to be seen. Across over 100 systems, the phrase echoed through comm channels, painted across rescue hulls, encrypted into AI conscience maps. The second light began when the first silence was answered. No directives, no force, only evidence. Because the Terrans weren't demanding change. They were making it unavoidable. On the war-torn plains of Veraxis, 3, where atmospheric shelling had rendered surface life extinct, a reclaimer craft landed in radioactive dusk. Its crew deployed zero-shift harvesters, atmospheric stitching machines, and genetic stabilization canopies. They rebuilt nothing of their own. They restored what had been lost. When questioned by a roaming newsburst AI, still recording despite radiation degradation, a Terran engineer replied, "We have no claim to this soil, but we remember who once did." And then she walked away. A movement formed. Non-Terran. Spontaneous. They called themselves the Returnless. Their principle was simple. We never met Earth, but we owe our tomorrow to its memory. They didn't fly Delta ships. They built local equivalents. Didn't recite oaths. They acted. One world at a time. One person at a time. Until their number outgrew official military registries, not by weapons, but by response hours logged. And no one could stop them. Because they weren't fighting. They were answering. In a private message to what was left of the Council's intelligence arm, one reclaimer ship, identified only as Echo Halo, responded to a silent tracking pulse with a brief burst. "We don't hide. We just don't need permission." That burst went viral. Again, on Olivex, where biological weapon testing had once rendered half the ecosystem into screaming static, a memory tower was raised, built of recovered wreckage, lined with names of beings who had never been recorded in any galactic census. At its peak, a beacon pulsed one phrase per orbit. "We are still someone's." No government built it. No charter funded it. A reclaimer ship delivered parts. Locals assembled the rest. And no one defaced it. Because it wasn't a monument. It was a confession they could touch. Earth's coordinates remained unlisted, but its presence spread like a philosophy coded into action. The symbol Delta became synonymous not with origin, but with refusal. Refusal to stand by. Refusal to edit truth. Refusal to forget. And so, A new compact formed, not centralized, but distributed. It wasn't led. It wasn't managed. It simply emerged. 1,000 species, 10,000 systems, countless voices, all operating on a shared principle once lost to time. If no one else comes, we will. On Earth, or what was left of it, grass grew over the foundations of its last cities. There were no palaces, no launch bays, no victory shrines, just memory gardens, walkways lined with stones that whispered old names, wind chimes tuned to human vocal frequencies. And once a year, reclaimer vessels circled silently overhead, not to celebrate, to mourn, not because they lost, but because they survived being forgotten. In orbit, a memory array named Soul's Mercy reactivated a long-range beacon never meant to be used again. It pulsed once every 7 hours. A signal composed not of light, but of feeling, a quantum-layered resonance encoding compassion, grief, and choice. Ships from dozens of species synced to it. And in doing so, every being aboard those ships felt the collapse as if they had lived it. Not to suffer, to understand. The final records of the reclaimers weren't logs. They were letters, left in relay caches, time-locked message fields, and black box drones adrift in deep current, all bearing the same postscript. If you are reading this, it means we did our part. Now it's your turn. The galaxy didn't fall. It pivoted on one truth. The ones you abandon may one day become the ones who hold you up. And when that day comes, the only question left is whether you're willing to be forgiven. At the edge of mapped space, where stellar drift blurs into the unknown, a final station flickered online. It bore no flags, no banners, only a name carved into its outer hull with terrifying simplicity. We were the silence. No one claimed ownership. No council delegation inaugurated it. But ships came, thousands of them. Drifting vessels, colony craft, refugee barges, courier platforms, and living arcs from species long thought lost. Each entered. Each left different. Because the station didn't store data. It stored witnesses. Not of Earth. Of those Earth didn't forget. Inside the station's core was a hall, wide, low-ceilinged, silent. On one wall, a phrase burned endlessly in white-blue starlight. We did not survive to dominate. We survived to make sure you were seen. And below it, a single object. Not a weapon. Not a monument. A child's handprint, pressed into carbon stone before Earth's sky fell. A print that outlived the war. Outlived the empire. Outlived the forgetting. Because someone chose to carry it. The council, or what fragments of it still functioned, sent observers. They arrived not with demands, but with hesitation. They requested access to the Earthborn archives. The response came not from Earth, but from a dozen species acting as keepers. The message was simple. Access requires only one thing. Tell your own truth first. And one by one, they did. The historians, the soldiers, the officials who had voted Earth's memory into shadow. They spoke, not to be cleansed, to be connected. And when they were done, the keepers opened the archives, not as data, as feeling. The council learned that knowledge is not power. Acknowledged memory is. From that point forward, no civilization erased again. Every species maintained the Delta Ledger, a global imprint of its greatest failings and greatest restorations. Not to glorify, to remember. Because now the galaxy knew. Erased voices do not disappear. They become currents in the dark. And if you listen hard enough, they will call you home. Earth's children, the reclaimers, never asked to be followed. They asked only that someone else would answer next. And in time, others did. Not to mimic, to echo. And in that echo, something happened that no civilization had managed since the stars were first named. A silence that once consumed became the signal that bound everyone together. On a relay stone in the center of the Delta Memorial Ring, the last message from Earth plays once per cycle. It is short, unpolished, human. We were broken, but we remembered you. And now you remember us. This is not a war story. This is a story of not letting go, of what happens when the forgotten return, not to punish, but to answer a question no one knew they'd asked. Will anyone come if we call again? And Earth did, so that no one else would ever have to wonder again.